Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to knit a nice chunky scarf. In most of my videos I've used kind of a thinner yarn, or I guess a normal size yarn. I haven't really tended to use chunky or bulky yarn just because it's kind of big and difficult to maneuver sometimes for tutorials. So for this one I figured I would show you how I do kind of thicker, chunkier scarves like this one. All you're going to need for this project obviously is a thicker yarn of your choosing, and then a larger knitting needle, and then a cable knitting needle if you're going to do a cable. But let's be honest, a chunky scarf looks good no matter what pattern you follow. I mean, you don't even have to do a cable, you could just do garter stitch for the whole thing, and I guarantee it's going to look cool just because chunky scarves are, they just look cool. So here's what I have so far. I've actually only spent a day working on this. This is just a couple hours work, but because the yarn is so thick it builds up pretty quickly, so I think I can finish the scarf by hopefully a couple days. I tend to get sidetracked very easily, but hopefully I'll finish this soon enough. It's really heavy though, so that's one thing to keep in mind. It's definitely like a thick winter scarf to have. In terms of the yarn, that's the main thing here that makes up a chunky scarf. The yarn I'm using is size 6. It's acrylic, and it's called, this the Lion brand is that I'm using, and for them they call it the super bulky yarn, I think, size 6, super bulky. I'm pretty sure those standards and that kind of terminology is shared across the board with different yarns. So size 6, super bulky, and it recommends that you use actually a larger knitting needle than I have. But this, I think, is fine. It's just making it a little tighter, so it's making it a thicker scarf, which I'm fine with. The size of the knitting needle that I'm using is size 8, so 8 millimeters. It recommends using a size 10, which I think would be too big, which would make, I mean, it would be fine, I think, for making a scarf that's not as thick and kind of looser, but in this case, I like how it's turning out a little tighter, and it's making the cables kind of stand out more. For the pattern, I'm doing a Celtic braid, and I have a video tutorial for how to do the Celtic braid just on its own, and I'll leave a link below in the description on how to do that. Just because it's kind of complicated, it takes a while to explain it. You're basically just doing a bunch of interlocking X's, creating this braid. But the one thing that I'm doing differently with this one than what I do normally with a Celtic braid is that I'm doing a stockinette stitch for the entire section. So normally with a Celtic braid, and in my Celtic braid tutorial, for the bits that are underneath the cable here in these little holes, I do a purl or a reverse stockinette stitch. So these are purled here, and they're kind of pushed further to the back. But for simplicity's sake, I guess you could say, I just decided to do a stockinette stitch for the whole thing. And you actually can't tell the difference. You really can't tell that it's, I mean, you can tell it's stockinette, but the cables go over it just as fine. There's not really any like bubbling or popping out that's happening. So I'm happy with how it's turning out, and I think I'll just show you a couple rows of how I'm doing it. So I have casted on 28 stitches in total. Normally for like a normal size yarn, you wouldn't get something this wide or this thick. So that's why using chunky yarn is helpful, because you get basically a big project, a long scarf, in a shorter amount of time, just because of the space that it takes up. So I've got 28 stitches. The Celtic braid takes up at least 26 stitches. And then again, if you check out that tutorial, that'll kind of explain in depth how to incorporate a Celtic braid into any of your projects. So for now, I just do a garter stitch for my border. So 1, 2 stitches. And I'm at the point in my Celtic braid where I need to break up these 3 X's that I have. So I've got 1, 2, 3 X's. So for the first X, I'm going to go ahead and break that up. To do that, I've got my cable knitting needle, and they have larger cable knitting needles for like larger yarn like this, but I find that just using a small one like this works just as as well, and it's actually kind of easier to manage than anything else. But if you're using super thick yarn that is like way too thick, you can probably use like, I've actually used like a pencil before, just because a pencil is thick enough, or a pen or something like that. And so I've broken up that X here, and the one thing that's different is like normally I would keep these purled, so I would purl off these 2 stitches from the cable needle, but because I'm keeping everything stockinette stitch with my braid, I don't need to worry about that, so I just go straight into knitting it instead of purling it. So, I mean, that's probably the easiest thing about the pattern, is that it's just keeping that stitch the whole time. Normally I like to complicate things and change the stitch. Now I'm just kind of rambling, I think. But let's continue. So continue splitting with that X. I just bring those 2 to the front with my cable needle, knit the 2 behind it, and then knit these 2 off of the cable needle. Even though it's chunky yarn and my cable needle is really thin, I haven't really had too much of a problem using the smaller cable needle. So I've broken up that X now. You can kind of see better that it's being split in 2. And now I'm on to the next one. And I go straight into the cable needle for this one. And split it up. I've mentioned before with like my Celtic braid tutorials and that kind of thing, and then and a couple of other cable knitting projects that I have, is that I love doing big kind of cable projects like this because I love always having to do something. It's really easy to get, I guess, bored of a knitting project, or just kind of caught up in the monotonous flow of doing things. But when you're doing a big braid like this, almost every row you're doing something different with the cable needle, or having to pay attention to moving one of the arms of the braid or something like that. So you're always kind of, I guess, not entertained, because I guess, well, knitting is entertaining, but you're kept busy. So, I mean, you don't fall into just boredom completely. So this is my last X that I have now, and I'm going to break that one up as well. Put those on, move it to back, knit this one off, knit this one off, and then knit these 2 from the back. So normally I would, again, purl these ones in the back, but for this one I just decided not to. I actually was inspired by a sweater that I saw at a store, and it had a pattern like this. It had like a interwoven kind of cable like this, but it was all stockinette stitch, and the stockinette bits that were in between here were really popping up, just because they had done, I think the cables were like 5 or 4 stitches thick, so they were really big, and the spaces between were really big, so the stockinette had more room to kind of pop up. And I thought that was kind of cool, so I tried to replicate that. And another project didn't quite work out, but I saw that, I mean, you can use stockinette stitch all the way through for braid, so there's no downside to doing that, so I decided to do it for this one. So for this last one, knit these off. And put that away. Finish off my border with just the garter stitch. I mean, the border for this one, when you're using chunky yarn, I like to keep the border as small as possible, just because the emphasis really is on the cables. And I mean, it's chunky yarn. Like, it's gonna be, the cable's gonna be the main thing no matter what, because the yarn is so big and thick. So there's no need to do like a huge intricate border or anything like that. So this is where the easy part comes in now. the back side, I just knit all the way through, just do the border like normal. And because my whole braid is stockinette stitch, I don't need to worry about changing my stitches or anything like that. I can just purl all the way through, just purl the purls, and then finish up the border, obviously, with 2 knit stitches. So that is kind of the biggest relief, I think. And definitely with the Celtic braid, it can get really complicated. And so the last thing you want to do is accidentally purl something or knit something that you weren't supposed to. But when you do stockinette stitch all the way through for something complicated like a Celtic braid, it takes away the, I guess, the confusion. Because normally I'd be like checking the front and checking the back and making sure that I'm continuing the stockinette stitches or continuing the purls or the reverse stockinette stitch, that kind of thing. I'd be worried about doing that throughout this entire back side. But since it's all stockinette stitch, it doesn't matter. You can just purl all the way through, which is exactly what I'm doing. Back on the front side, you can see these 3 X's that I created here. They're just nicely split up, and now they're ready for another row of crisscrossing. So I'm going to cross these 2 stitches, these 2 X's right here, over each other. And then these 2 arms of the braid are going to just stay straight. They're going to keep going. So for this row, I mean, it's a pretty tight braid. On this next front row, I'm going to go right in with my cable needle and do these X's here. I'm not going to like knit through it and then knit through it again and give it some space. I keep it pretty tight. And so this is kind of what it ends, this is what it's ending up looking like. So I'm satisfied with it. I really like how it's turning out. And hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of what you can do with chunky yarn. And a lot of times I've been kind of afraid of like upgrading my yarn to a chunkier yarn just because I don't know how it's going to interact with the pattern. But I like how this is looking. And so hopefully if you have a project that you want to maybe use a different type of yarn with, this gives you an idea. So you can kind of look at this one and say, oh, well, maybe my pattern won't look so bad with a thicker yarn after all. So let me know what you think in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about the Celtic braid, definitely check out the tutorial I have. There's a link below in the description. Otherwise, I will see you next time.